Awesome. Well, welcome to our event. My name is Costella Copeland Smith. I'm the vice chair for the Windsor Human Relations Commission.
Yes, she is.
Yes. Today we'll be talking about understanding the Native American and Indigenous experience here in America. We're going to work on decolonizing our minds. So really going over a little bit of the history, but mainly talking about contemporary issues, making sure we're all on the same page. So I do have a short film snippets that I will be sharing. So welcome once again, everyone, to the event. You'll see here on my right that there is Trudy Richmond, who is a member of one of the tribal nations. I'm going to attempt to pronounce it because I'm not a part of this tribe myself. The Skagit-Koke tribal nation, and is nationally, and this person here is a Connecticut. They're from Connecticut, which is great. And this is a very well-known and respected educator, author, activist, and master storyteller. So just wanted to point that out, that we have some amazing Indigenous people from Connecticut who are doing awesome work. So in order for us to get on the same page here with our event, I'm going to show a short film snippet. I'll be posting these slides later on in the chat. Just give me a thumbs up so that I know that you can see and hear it. This video does not have closed captions. I did try to see if I could get closed captions, but yeah, just wanted to let that know. Okay. All right, here we go.
Say the company is blocking their efforts to unionize and refusing to negotiate voices for unions. The overturning of Roe versus Wade is having an effect on television. A new report says abortion showed up with nearly 25% more shows compared to last year. NPR's Melissa Blair has in a September law order, a teenager from Texas goes to New York to get an abortion. The ban in Texas took effect 30 days after Roe was overturned. She didn't know what else to do. She gets help from an abortion fund volunteer.
All right, so that was our little film snippet. I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to our chairman, Judge Kevin Washington, for the opening.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. Merry Christmas. Happy Hanukkah. Happy Kwanzaa. Happy happy holidays. I'm just gonna leave it there, okay? It's good to see you all, the ones that I can see. If you want to put your face on, great. If you don't, that's cool too. I just want to welcome you all to our last conversation for the year. This is one of my favorites, I think. It was supposed to happen in November, but due to circumstances, it didn't. So we moved it to December. I just want to say thanks to our partners in conversations and doing the work, which are Grace Church, First Church of Windsor, Archer Memorial, and Hopewell Baptist Church. We are so grateful to be working with these entities and other community entities and having these discussions and conversations. I'd like to recognize my chair, my vice chair to my right screen. That's why I keep looking over there. Cassie, you're on my right. And James is my secretary on my left. And I see Mr. Byron Bob who is also one of my commissioners on there. Thank you, Ms. Grossman. I see you over there. Hopefully others will attend. So this is our conversation on Native American and Indigenous people. Please be sure to participate. If you know somebody that may get a kick out of this, it will appear on YouTube. Thank you to Mr. Patrick McMahon, who serves as our liaison, and also our assistant, Sandra Brown. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to my vice chair, and I'll shut up. Bye.
Thank you, Judge Kevin Washington, for those lovely opening remarks. So before we begin, as you know, we are talking about the Native American and Indigenous people's experience. Before every event that we've had, we'd like to recognize that we here in Connecticut are on stolen land. So the tribes that were within the land that we commonly know as Windsor, Hartford, et cetera, are Pequannock, Tunxus, Puxatani, the River Tribes, the Podunk, the Wagunk, and the Algonquin tribes. Some people will put all these tribes under the River Tribes, but they each distinctively have their own culture, their language, and how they celebrate and how they move about. And specifically within Connecticut, you'll see this said in the 1600s, around when the Europeans came here to colonize. So a lot of the indigenous people who were in the Windsor area are no longer in the Windsor area. Many of them have moved to South Windsor or other tribes. You'll see that here in the blue section that it's really spread out far north and farther south. So there are still some active tribes in the surrounding areas. In one of our previous events, we went over the history of Windsor, and Windsor was really a larger area. Historically, Windsor was kind of around this area based on this map. And then later on, after the Pequot War and many other wars that happened, they split into South Windsor, East Windsor, then there's Central Windsor, then there's Hartford, West Hartford, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a very vast, interesting history in that. I encourage you to go check out our previous recording on it. We did a deep dive with the Windsor Historical Society on it. We watched 10 interesting facts about Native Americans. You'll see that here are some other film snippets, some provided by commissioners. Much of this presentation was put together by the commissioners and myself. So I always implore you to stay educated. So we don't have any panelists outside of ourselves, so thank you. And this is our flyer here. Originally it was for November, but here we are today. So when you go to our website, you will see a flyer similar to this, and you'll click on it and it'll have the link. So our guidelines here for when we have our conversation are pretty straightforward, but again, I like to go over these because this establishes a common ground for all of us to be able to have a safe and informative conversation. So I would say speak from the I or speak from your knowledge base. I'm going to edit this afterwards. Speak from your knowledge base and your understanding of things, and listen to understand one another instead of being quick to be like, oh, well, someone said something about this, I have to respond, instead of really listening to what someone is saying and how it impacts you. Lean into discomfort and feelings. There's a lot of feelings. Colonialism impacted a lot of marginalized people back in the day and up to present for how we understand academia and ourselves now. So a lot of feelings may come up, and I challenge you to lean into them if you feel comfortable doing so. Confidentiality is pretty straightforward. For here on Zoom, all of the lessons that we learn will leave with us, but the stories that we have here will stay within this space. Being respectful is just staying muted, waiting your turn to talk. You can also use the chat. So if you're like, I might have a sore throat or I may be under the weather, that's totally fine. You can type in the chat and directly message me, myself, or others on the commission if you have any questions, or you can just pose out some of your thoughts and ideas to the whole group if you feel comfortable. And finally, I like to see these as challenge by choice. The more you participate, the more you're going to get out of it. And we're all in different spaces in our lives. I know, especially for me, I'm trying to still figure out what I want to do with life and how I'm going to just express myself. So we want to agree to disagree with grace, meaning like I might have my own social and cultural and political views, but that doesn't mean that my way is the right way, and vice versa. We can all have our lovely different cultures and identities and still meet at the same table. So this is just some guidelines for us to follow. If you want to add some, let me know. But this is just a little space for us to establish a common ground. And our brief agenda is just to go over a couple, once again, to establish a common ground so we all have knowledge on the topic, and then we'll just talk about it as a group. So today we're really wanting to understand the Indigenous experience and reflect on the changes that we can make within our community. Because as I said before, we're on stolen land, meaning that this land was not ours to begin with. People from England came over and were like, we don't like the religious persecution. Let's come over to this country and then persecute the people living here. So before you know it, like the cycle of oppression continues, whether it was intended, whether there was good intentions or not. So here's a brief historical timeline. And yes, it does go back to the 1400s. And if you go even farther back, you can go to biblical times and ancient times, because there's a fascinating connection between Indigenous people here and Asian American people. It's really cool, but that's a whole other topic, but just wanted to have a brief timeline. And because it's kind of hard to see, I made it a little bigger for us to look at here. And the timeline starts with Columbus, then going into the 16 and 1700s, where disease and war kills a lot of the Indigenous people here. And then comes a string of acts, a lot of different acts from the government and treaties that were constantly broken, where the United States government was like, here, like, we'll give you some of the land. You can buy your own land back after we stole it from you. So every time they'd come up with a new policy or treaty or something, they'd be like, okay, let's follow it. These Indigenous people are like, okay, like, I'm gonna lean into this. Let's see if we can do it. And every single time from the 1800s all the way up to present day, the last one was Standing Rock. I had a lot of friends who participated in that movement. They were there the days that the police started to arrest and place them in internment camps. So that's up to present day. It's 2016. It was only a few years ago. So a lot of interesting things have happened in between there, including the Wounded Knee Massacre, the Indian New Deal, a lot of different Indian placement programs where the government would provide money and resources, but it wouldn't be the resources that the Indigenous people would need, like healthcare, education. But instead it's like, oh, we built casinos here on your land. You can come here anytime you want. But that's like, but we need healthcare, education. So this, again, brief historical timeline. There's a lot of rich history about this as well. And you'll see there's a lot of terms that are going on as well. You'll see the term Indigenous, you'll see the term Native American, American Indian, Amerindian, Amerind, Indian Aboriginal American, First National Nation person, Indigenous Americans, Indigenous person. So like in many other conversations we've had about Black Indigenous people of color, there's so many different ways for people in this community to refer to themselves. And if you're not sure, just ask. That's always my rule of thumb. Same thing with the LGBTQ community, within the BIPOC community, within the Asian American. And when we had the Asian American Pacific Islander event, we had a very similar thing. Across many cultures, many races, many social identities, terminology is constantly changing. We may be calling people of this culture and of this race Indigenous people for now, but it could change like tomorrow. This is constantly changing. So again, if you're not sure, ask and maybe inform yourself. There's a really interesting conversation going on within the community and also within the BIPOC community as well. So as I said, there's a lot of different Indigenous cultures. You'll see that the actual Indigenous Veterans Day is recognized as on November 8th of every November each year in the United States. And we just wanted to recognize and honor that there are Indigenous people who were like, you know what, even though we had our culture and our land stripped from us, we will still fight and still support. So it's fascinating to see what has happened over time. So long before Christopher Columbus arrived, there were over like roughly 50 million people living in America. So he didn't discover it. Now, I'm just pointing that out to say that in the American education system, people are taught like, well, he discovered America, thinking that America was India, and it's like, no, there were people here already, and it's a whole that's a whole other debate that some people lean into. And anthropologists actually categorize a lot of the subgroups into 10 separate cultures, and then this is where you can start to see almost multiraciality and multi-ethnic backgrounds, because these separate cultures include the Arctic, the subarctic, the Northeast, the Southeast, the Plains, the Southwest, the Great Basin, California, the Northwest Coast, and the Plateau. And if you look at how it's broken up, it's kind of into different geographical regions within the United States territories, but also expanding farther above into Canada, further below into Mexico, all the way up through Alaska, where Alaska and the Asian continent used to actually be connected by ice. So that's also something else to consider when it's like, why is the Arctic up there? It's like, don't forget about Alaska. So if you want to check out more about the specific 10 subgroups, you can check out history.com and some information you'll see throughout this presentation. Later on, and again, we're summing up thousands upon thousands of years of history in a short time. In the United States, there were more than 500 federally recognized Indigenous nations with around 3 million people. So there's this common notion that like, oh, there's not that many of us left, or oh, they're like, you're not really seen as people and as nations. And that's not necessarily true. I think in the past, with the treaties being constantly broken, people had to fight for their rights. They had to fight for their land back. They had to fight for water, like access to clean water, education, food. And Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz actually challenges the narrative and policies that target Indigenous people and how they've been marginalized over time, and how you can still rise up and challenge that over time. Because a lot of the policies are still pretty racist and still saturated in white supremacy and still perpetually hurt not only Indigenous people, but Black Indigenous people of color and people from other marginalized communities as well, whether it's class, gender, race, sexual orientation, etc. So when we kind of dive deeper into this, for Native Americans, land is more than just the ground. There's a lot of spiritual connection. So you're going to see an intersection not only of race and culture, but also with religion and spirituality, and also sexual orientation, because there are aspects of some tribes that believe that sexual orientation is also very spiritual. So you got a little intersection on top of an intersection. And you'll see here there are some posters and infographics on some more recent statistics about the demographics, population, language, and education of the current Indigenous population within Alaska Natives in the United States. So just want to put that out there. And here is the book by Roxanne Dunbar. If you want to check it out, go to your local library, or you can check it out and see if you can purchase a copy online. She goes deep into it as well, about giving an uncensored version of the United States history from an Indigenous perspective. As I said before, there are a lot of treaties, policies, and broken promises, and this kind of happened between the late 1700s and the late 1800s. A lot of this was archived. Someone took the time, and you can actually go to the archives and view all of the original treaties, the original language, the original promises that were made. And you'll see I just highlighted a couple here. There are a lot of treaties that happened across each of the states. One of them includes the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. That's more recent. where they're trying to provide more educational assistance. But once again, from whose perspective are you teaching United States history? From whose perspective and culture are you teaching these different skills, and saying, well, whose is more valuable? Is it the indigenous way that's more valuable, or the current way that is more valuable based off of capitalism and the way our society runs? Also, another one is the Lakota delegation of 1891. This was actually cited in the Standing Rock incident in 2016. I know that was a couple of years ago, where the United States government was with war for the Lakota for gold, and that didn't really have a resolution. So when they wanted to also build a pipeline after they had a war about gold, it's just, you can start to see how things continue to perpetuate over time. And then also there's the Tribal Self-Government Act of 1994, where the United States government is trying to recognize different indigenous cultures and politics as its own sovereign entity, because before they weren't valuing, the government was not valuing indigenous peoples' cultures as its own sovereign people, saying like, oh, you gotta conform to our whole democracy, your whole thing ain't cutting it. That's how they had it at the time. And that wasn't until the 90s. That wasn't that far ago as well. That was like, what, 30 some odd years? So just want to point that out. And also here you'll see there are a lot of health disparities. This is a huge issue to this day. I know Dr. Barbara Gurr from the University of Connecticut studies a lot of indigenous people and their access to healthcare, and their mortality rate is very high. Also, with addiction for drugs and opportunities to get better services is disproportionate in comparison to a lot of the groups within the United States. So you'll see their percentages and mortality rates here on the right. And if you know of anyone who would find these services useful, you'll see there's resources and additional data. So definitely please share out if you know of anyone in these situations currently, whether that you're in the state of Connecticut or if you're in another state as well. And here's a picture here, way back when. I think it's always great to kind of contextualize from where we were to where we are now as a society, and how they did have an act where they said, kill the Indian, save the man, where they would start to have cultural appropriation, where people were valuing a white heteronormative culture over the culture that a lot of the indigenous people brought in already. So just wanted to put that out there as well. And finally, here we are today. Before we head into our discussion, here we are today with a lot of issues. This is the issues that a lot of the upcoming Indigenous children are going to be faced with. The history, status, and future is kind of it with the Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, how over time it has continually been cut down and less money has been going into their needs. And it's like, well, wait, how are we supposed to survive, and not only survive, but then thrive, if you're not going to help us? You know, like you took our land, you took everything that we had, and then you're not going to help us, and the funds keep going down. So that's a contemporary issue that is continuing onwards today. There still is a lot of white savior complex rhetoric that can still be heard, especially with like that phrase that I was saying before that they said back in the day. This is still known around, especially not only within United States politics, but also a lot of myths and biases that people may have when it's like, when you meet an Indigenous person in real life, it's like, oh, I thought you were gonna look more like that other picture, or oh, I thought you all wore the same kind of garb, and it's kind of, so it's breaking down those bias and preconceived notions. Then we have current problems and struggles. Again, access to resources, unemployment, healthcare, voting, and a culture and language dying out. There are a lot of Indigenous people where they want to, preserve their language and make sure that the next generation can continue their traditions, whether it's with dance and food, or whether it's the way that they live and practice their spirituality. Also, Native Americans are getting left behind in the remote work economy. If you look at where we are as a society in the United States, there's certain populations that aren't getting educated on how to keep up with technological skills, or they're not keeping up with, you know, the COVID-19 crisis and getting accessibility. It took 6 to 8 months for some of them later after the vaccine had come out, just so that they could get access. I had some of my friends who worked on the front lines and they said, this is terrible, where they went all the way up through North Dakota. And it's just like, why are these people 6 to 8 months behind with everything? Or they didn't even know that like certain crises were going on. It's like, oh, well, why do we have to wear a mask? And how about this and that? So it's really interesting to see how certain Indigenous populations, depending on your geographical location, get left out. Also, mascots. This was a big one in not only for the Redskins, but also for Conard High School here in West Hartford, Connecticut. And there's been a really interesting conversation going on, and I'm sure we're going to talk more in depth about it. But basically, a lot of schools or sports using the logos, or not only logos, but using the culture of Indigenous people, saying, oh, that can be our mascot. That's going to be our, like, you know, we're going to be the Warriors, or we're going to be the Indians. And actually, the survey kind of shows that most of the Indigenous people said that they were offended by the Redskins name, but they were not offended by the sports fans performing the tomahawk chop, which, you know, it's really interesting seeing, like, you know, what people are offended by. And again, this is constantly changing over time. But it is, you know, saying that a lot of these fans were upset when, you know, fans were imitating the Native American dances and things that were very sacred to their culture. So again, some food for thought that, you know, that has been an ongoing conversation, especially in Connecticut, with schools using Indigenous people's practices and items for mascots and logos. And I wanted to point out that Deb Holland is confirmed as the Interior Secretary, becoming the first Native American to hold a cabinet level position. And this happened this year, 2022. We've come a long way, and yet, you know, it's why did it take this long for Indigenous people to become a part of more of our political system and to hold such a high position? So again, just food for thought as we're talking about understanding the Indigenous experience. And that's it. I tried to keep it super brief, super quick, so that way we all can kind of talk about not only the Indigenous experience, but how can we recognize what has happened and then move forward from it. So I will pause here. I have some starter questions if you'd like, or if any of you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or type it in the chat. But I will stop my screen share. And if anyone has any thoughts, opinions, questions, feel free to let me know. Oh, and I can put the slides in the chat. They are right here. So if you want to kind of take a deeper dive and click on some of the links, feel free to do so. Oh, and I'll type it in the chat. Any initial thoughts, ideas, or reactions? There you go.
Cassie, thank you for that comprehensive presentation. It was really good. I really enjoyed it. My feelings on the topic are, you know, you don't know what you don't know. So you have to learn and be open to being educated as to what's going on. I did hear about all the news with the schools, even Windsor, in regards to the Windsor Warriors. You know, and I don't know if Windsor is going to remove Warriors. I don't recall that discussion if that's what's going to happen or not. So I'm not aware, but Thank you for that full and comprehensive presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Absolutely. Thanks for your initiation for the conversation. I was a Windsor High School graduate. We did have a logo change because this issue was brought up around when Obama was elected, and this was also like, like, oh my gosh. So what they did was they kept the warriors, saying we're just going to keep warriors because it can have multiple meanings. But they used to have an Indian head behind it, like an Indian chief like head as the logo. So they changed it to an arrow instead.
Okay, so it's something like an artifact and not the real thing. Of the culture. Yeah, kind of like that Mohawk argument, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting, that we're in this place. The same thing, it's all these people that are assimilated in this land before we even got here, and how they've kind of been pushed aside and the hypocrisy of, people coming from England on a boat and then coming here and doing the same thing that they left England because they were rejected. So I find that an interesting aspect of the conversation. And I really find a struggle with, how do we as a community help, Indigenous people, Native American people, how do, I guess, in a discussion like this, having discussions like this go a long way. But, it's like, it seems like it's such a closed society because they're very, I want to say protective of their culture, but it's hard for you as an outsider to get in because I think there's a feeling of mistrust. So I guess you need to relate to, I don't know if you relate one-to-one with them, or I don't know how it would be a proper way to interface with, these nations.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Marcia.
Yeah, I agree. This is really a great conversation to be having because I think part of the problem is there's been so little information available that it's been easy to buy into stereotypes or, use symbols that we think are meaningful to us and disparaging to others. So I think it's really good. One thing I think has improved is I know that the museum in, oh gosh, my brain is not functioning, but is it the Mashantucket?
Mm-hmm.
They're doing tremendous amount of research and they're sharing that research. So, and then there's the Indian Museum in Washington, Connecticut too, which looks as though it has been expanding what they have to offer. Because the only thing when I was doing my research 30 some years ago that I really couldn't find out much because it was, oh no, the Indians all disappeared. And yet I would interview people who said that they had relatives that were Blackfoot. And that I found interesting because I couldn't see anything about Blackfeet being in this part of the country. So
Yeah.
There's just so much that we really, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface, which I think is very important. So thank you for doing this.
Of course, yeah, it's really interesting. I think technology has really allowed for more accessibility. So like I see, Byron, you put a question, do Native American have people lobbying for them? And like back in the, in the 80s or 90s, like I wouldn't have been able to search or to understand. But when I was doing some more research for this presentation, there are people lobbying for them, but it's still very difficult to find, people who will also financially support them. So some of the people who are lobbying, and again, it depends on state and region, but there is the National Congress of American Indians. There's the Lobby League of the Indian tribes. There's a variety of legislation and lobbying groups that have different names based off the geographic location. And then there's also a really cool critical race theory curriculum out there, as lobbying is a strategy for tribal resilience as well. So if you look at critical race theory, I know we talked about it a while back, but there are subsects that go within to Black excellence, that go tribal resilience, that go into Latinx expression and reclamation. So it goes even further. But yeah, so to answer your question, Byron, yes, there's people lobbying, but not enough, because it's like you don't really see that on the news.
I find it interesting that we are such, even though by looking at us, we just don't know. And I think I said this the last time, we are all a part of each other in some form, ethnically. I'm part white somewhere, I'm part Native American. I believe that. Along with all the other isms, I am. So I find that interesting. And I also find it interesting, just like our Latinx culture, our Puerto Ricans are seeking or might be becoming a statehood, it's interesting that we can't take better care. I think Biden has made an effort with having the Chiefs meeting that he had earlier in the year, to making it known that the United States government is here to support.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And speaking of support, I see Byron in the chat. You have some great questions here. The only reason I know the answer is because one of my friends is Indigenous, and we talked about it a few summers ago. Are most of the casinos in the U.S. owned by Native Americans? And the answer is no. There's very few. Even the one up here in Mohegan Sun, the Indigenous people will get a percentage of the profits, and then they will get some space on the land. But for the most part, there's just the casino. So it's like, here you can enjoy gambling and alcohol from your percentages. So like it kind of, in a sense, feeds to the addictions and a lot of the health issues that are going on. Because I remember I talked about it with a friend, and I was like, oh my gosh, like that's so cool, because she had shared with me, and I got permission to share with her from it. But she was saying, she's like, I'm Irish, I'm white, and I'm Indigenous, and I think I got a little West Indian in there. And I was like, okay. And she's like, I go to Mohegan and I visit my family, and it's sad. And I was like, well, what do you mean it's sad? And she's like, all they do is smoke and drink. They get the money from the government and they just smoke and drink. And I'm like, that's weird. And she's like, well, that's, people don't realize, like, that's what's going on in Connecticut. It's like, there's like, what about the jobs and the healthcare and like all these other things? And it's just like, she's like, nope. And it's like, here's the money. They just spend it, wait for their next check from the government, spend it again. And I'm like, that's depressing to hear that, like, that's what's going on here in Connecticut. Is like, are there programs? Are there ways that we can support, like, economically or even educationally, not only just sharing of the culture, but like, what can we do as a community to help stop that cycle?
I try to understand what, I hear a lot of conversation from that diaspora about, our culture is being lost, and as you stated earlier, their language is being lost. So I find it interesting how they want to preserve that when it's not being passed down to their youth, and encouraging their youth to be participatory and to remember these traditions and what happened to our people.
Yep. Yeah, there's some interesting docuseries on it too, about like how they're trying to the Indigenous people are trying to preserve what's left and educating people, whether you're Indigenous or not. I've seen a lot of anthropologists and also some graduate students continue the tradition onwards, and like making sure that someone knows somewhere. And I think a couple of years ago, there was a researcher who came, I think it was either from Trinity College or CCSU, Connecticut Central, where they came to present on the intersection of slavery, Indigenous culture, and colonialism within Connecticut. It was really fascinating, their presentation on it.
Excellent.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Marcia.
Just making me think, that's all. But Joy Harjo and Scott Momaday are both poets, and that's one area where I've seen, wonderful passing down of heritage. And and then there's a new book that I'm interested in reading, which is by Tommy Orange, which I guess is about urban people. So there are lots of good things out there now that I don't think were there before. So that's helpful too. And appreciating the culture. When I grew up, I so wanted, sorry,
That's okay.
I wanted to be, I had a book about Native Americans. And I'm old, so this was a long time ago. And I wanted so much to be a Native American because everything about this book made me really respect them. And I don't know whatever happened to that book. But contrary, almost everything else that you hear growing up, it's, they're lazy. It's the same thing that I think African Americans get to, they're lazy, they don't want to work, they don't do anything. And so I wonder why that is. Why do we make that so difficult? So anyway, but there are good things out there too that are available. Now I'll shut up.
No, I appreciate it, because especially like when you're talking about good things too, there's a lot of good educational tools for elementary, like clear through high school students to like read about the culture, about the traditions in a respectable way, because that's where you get into appreciation versus appropriation. Because appropriation is like, let me take this and say it's mine. You see this with a lot of costumes, especially around Halloween time, or even with certain symbols such as dream catchers. Like you can just go in a store and buy one where it's like there's such a beautiful like spiritual practice where like the people who make it like have an intentionality behind it with the resources and how you gather and like the whole intent behind it. And yet capitalism and here in our society, we just take that and it's like, oh my gosh, like dream catcher. And it's like it's appropriated instead of appreciated.
Cassie, is there, I think you touched on it, is there curriculum developed or being developed for the public schools to include this, like talking about Juneteenth and that kind of thing? Is that being developed for Native American people? Or has that been already been conceptualized?
I don't think to the same extent, because I know there's the 1619 project, which by the way, there's going to be a new special on it. I highly encourage you to check it out. And that the 1619 project really focuses on decolonizing and understanding the true American history from African American perspectives. But for Indigenous people, I've only seen things slipped in. So the 1619 project kind of partially covers it, but at the same time, I don't think there's any explicit curriculum out there yet. I think it depends on the school systems, like in the Lakota tribes and those nations. I think out in like the Dakota areas, there may be more explicit teachings because it's like, oh, hey, can you come to our school? And it's like, oh, sure. But like, it's a bit different. Yes. And you got the book. Yeah. It's really interesting to see like how people are going about it. But there is such an intersection too within the American history around slavery and Indigenous people that people don't talk about.
Is there a separate course is there a course or a course outline at UConn that offers that? Do you know?
There's some, but it depends on the semester and the research topics. So a lot of it is regional. It depends on like where you are. But again, in Connecticut, most of it is down in the Mohegan area, or you can go to the what was it? Naugatuck region. They also have a center. Like a lot of the big towns that are named after tribes will generally have some like museums or educational centers. But
yeah, I think Marcia said in Washington, Connecticut, there's one. Is that correct? My town that I created on my own. What are you doing?
But yeah, it's interesting. I think we do need a bit more in education because it's like it's not really talked about in a good way, and people will often use Western film. I know, like through my educational experience, like that's where I learned the most of it. But you get into blackface and what's called yellowface as well, which is it's the same thing as blackface, except people will dress up as Indigenous people and pretend to be them. But it's definitely something where there's a big need for not only like education, but reparations as well.
Because it was like what was it, Zorro, where who had the Native American partner, sidekick? I can't think of the show.
The Lone Ranger.
The
Oh,
Lone
yeah,
Ranger.
yeah.
I read something that he was not even Native American, he was Caucasian. And they just made him look Native American. So I think television and film has a part in the negative portrayal of the people as savages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely is interesting. And I see, Byron, you put in the chat, I think the professional sports teams that use Native American logos or names should contribute to their causes such as healthcare and education, which is interesting because I think one or two of the NFL players on the Redskins teams actually did that, and he got flack for it. I'll never forget that because my grandparents used to be in that region where they would follow the Redskins, and it was like I remember seeing it all over the news, like, oh well, like, you know, they're changing the logos names, and one of the players actually felt bad, and then they're like, here, like, I want to do that, and then he was getting flack for it. They're like, oh, that's kind of you, but you're contributing. It was just like, it was bananas to me. It's just like, what? Like, you're helping them out and like people are upset at you for that. Like,
Yeah, I just don't think people, you know, think of Native American and Indigenous people as a charitable thing to provide services and to provide assistance with. I don't think that ever crosses anybody else's mind unless you lived in that life.
yeah.
You know, I don't think people think about donations to Native American causes and issues.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad. It's really sad.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. Especially because there's a lot of Indigenous shops, even around in Connecticut and online. There's a lot of Etsy shops. There's a lot of organizations where like they'll post saying family in need, and then they'll list things. And sometimes it's $200 or $300. And I see these posts quite often on Instagram for people who are in need. And a lot of it's from the Indigenous population. It's from LGBTQ population. It's like, it's really interesting to see. And it's kind of like, how can we really help better one another, whether it is access to hygiene? Like some of them were, I remember seeing some of them were like, just like dental and healthcare needs, whether it's like feminine care or pads or tampons or soap. One of them was soap and socks and food. And I was like, oh, and it's like, yeah.
The struggle is real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
James, what are you contemplating? I see you over there on the left side of my screen. I'm just waiting for him to explode.
So no. So I wrote down 5 things, right? And to me, they're on a continuum. And it's interesting because whenever I try to analogize things, I try to relate to my own circumstances that I can try to understand. For me, the military one is useful for 2 of the 5 bullets on my list, right? Which is the notion of identity or respect for an identity, which is kind of, I analogize that to being a Marine, right? So one of the things is if you really want to piss off someone in the Marine Corps, go buy yourself a Marine Corps uniform and wear it when you aren't a Marine. To me, it's very analogous to the notion of appropriation. And so the idea of that's actually my second bullet is the notion of mascots and appropriation. So the first one is just the respect for it, right? So even if you never were a Marine, if you're not dumb enough to join the Marine Corps, you know, if it's not your thing, like Kevin did, right? And I did. So just respect for it. People say, "Wow, you're a Marine," and it's like, if you are one, you're kind of like, you get used to people saying that, and it's like, it's cool, I respect that, but it's like, at some level, I did my job, right? But I think people who weren't Marines actually have a higher opinion than if you were the Marine Corps. It's like, you should have known some of the guys I knew, right? But there's a respect for the identity question, right, which comes in there for the notion of being Marine. Same thing with the respect for identity if Native American or whatever else, right? It's not respectful. For example, we watched Peter Pan the other day, the movie that was made like 70 years ago. Whoa, and it has a disclaimer at the beginning, warning this has some really biased stuff in it. But that was like just a Disney movie. I believe it was Disney back then, right? And you should watch it if you've never seen it. It's horrible to Native Americans. But that to me is a violation of the first of the 5 levels, which is respect. Which is, and again, I analogize the Marine Corps. It's like, yeah, people have respect for Marines, and it's earned, as much as I joke about the, bozos I may have served with, right? It's a hard job, and, there's an achievement there. But the second one down is the appropriation thing, right? And I look at like the warriors, actually, that is the name the Marine Corps uses, is they refer to it as warrior training and stuff like that. and we use rifles, cross rifles, as one of our symbols. So if we replace the spear and feathers in Windsor with cross rifles, but kept the name warrior to mean something analogous to the Marine Corps warrior, still say, yeah, but you're not a bunch of Marines. Drop it, right? So I can see, I can connect with the appropriation problem on second of the 5 bullets here. So I can see where that's as a problem too. It's like, yeah, no, you don't get to put a really dark red face as your mascot and say, the Redskins and stuff like that. What's interesting is it starts to go down the continuum. I am a conservative, and so it's not surprising that when you say, people are using welfare money to buy the next drink and wait for the next welfare check, I do think there is a trap in welfare. It's one of the reasons I'm a conservative, right? And I respect that there's disagreement on that, but that doesn't surprise me, right? And so on the 4th of my 5 bullets here, because I skipped over the 3rd one on purpose, but welfare, it scares me, right? And I come from a background of being poor. I know we were on women's and children, we had earned income tax credit, and we were in HUD housing. And if you know anything about being poor, you can tell how poor we were and weren't just by the 3 programs I named. Because there are we knew who the really poor kids were in the neighborhood by what programs they were on. You know who the rich kids were because they weren't on any programs, but they still lived in our neighborhood, right? So we kind of knew how everyone's poverty level based on their programs. But so I grew up around a lot of that stuff, and it's like, I'm a little sensitive to it. And then 5th on the list is the notion of reparations, and that's even beyond welfare. And that one has a whole discussion unto itself. But when I jumped over is opportunity, because I've mentioned before, I'm a huge capitalist. And not in the way a lot of times people who are anti-capitalist frame capitalism. I believe it's a bad framing. It's strawmanning the notion of capitalism. But to me, one of the biggest things in capitalism is the opportunity to make your own way economically. And I also believe as a capitalist that economics is the foundation of everything else. Let's face it, if you don't know where your next meal is coming from, your life is hard. If you can take care of all your financial insecurities, you can suddenly go out and make the world a better place and so on, right? And so a 3rd of my 5 bullets is the question of opportunity. Are people being held back from opportunity based on their demographics? And that's true of all demographic groups, including Native American. But to me, that's the third. Those first 3, I'm totally in support of, especially the first 2 is that I analogize them to the Marine Corps. There's the opportunity question. I do want to be cautious of the welfare thing. And my only statement on reparations is like, we weren't here. And so one of the biggest challenges with the notion of reparations, okay, my ancestors were in Italy before 1910. And it's like, and that's just my personal situation. Then you look at all the other things that are going on. It's really, really hard to process that one. So I get the notion of, as a capitalist, of property rights and who's there first. Okay, cool. But it's like, how do you even resolve that? So to me, those are the 5 levels of everything that we mentioned in the last half hour. But there is a continuum. It's like, yeah, you absolutely should respect everybody for in their identity. You really shouldn't steal people's stuff. Just like if someone runs around wearing a Marine Corps uniform, I'm like, I'm going to be the first one pissed off, right? Then I do believe in equality of opportunity for everyone, but it's a little bit tricky when you start getting into the last 2. And so for me, there's a continuum there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing. I know things change over time, because I think I remember watching the film Django with my grandfather, father, and uncle once, and it was really interesting seeing how the slaves were treated, but also how Indigenous people fit in there. And the conversation then was very different than how we are now. And I was able to talk with my grandfather before he passed away at the time, was and how he remembers Indigenous people, and how from his perspective, he was sharing I felt bad for them because I'm Black in America, but you're Indigenous. And it was an interesting conversation to have that, because he remembered being oh, the West films, that kind of reminds me of home and how people were back in the day. So it was really interesting to kind of see how things shift over time and who gets left within the narrative of TV and film and who doesn't. And I know it's interesting, Byron, you put that in the chat as well. It's we should have marathons for Indigenous people for other causes. And it's yeah, I think it would be cool to have specific fundraising events, but also to have a mainstream series or a mainstream something where people would sit and actually learn about Indigenous culture and care about it too. Because if society doesn't care about a cause or about understanding things, then it doesn't take off. It's oh, if it's not, over dramatic or popular, people tend to not care as much. But again, that's just my opinion and how I understand and see the news in the world. But what are y'all's thoughts?
Well, I think people forget or don't tend to relate that Native American and indigenous people were slaves as well, or enslaved people as well. And I think people forget that factor, that they were enslaved as well. There were slaves that were Native American and indigenous indigenous people.
Yeah.
which is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, there's a big intersection where it's just like, yeah, and if you look in history too, where like how African and indigenous people were like forced together, but then how that's where you started to get if you look into the history of multiracial marriage, like that's where some of that comes about as well. It's like where not only just with the slave and the master, but then it's like, oh, we're race mixing and how bad that is, and how look where we are today in our culture, and how it's like very, I don't want to say normalized, but it is more acceptable in a sense. But it's really interesting to see how even culturally within like back during those times for indigenous cultures and African cultures, how preposterous it was to even go outside.
And you know, Cassie, it also speaks to the cultures of our cuisines, our foods. For instance, grits, which are an African American staple, you know, come from indigenous people who ground corn.
Yep.
So I think that everything transcends through everybody's culture. You know, we have grits because indigenous people had corn, ground corn, which is cornmeal, which turns into a grit that we ground up because we were enslaved people as well, and that's all we had to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm gonna go over here and make my hoe cakes, and then we'll be done. No.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting to see.
So
food
transcends culture as well through many diasporas.
Yeah.
You know? Beans
So
and rice.
Yeah,
Yeah, beans and rice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep, beans, rice, grits, fashion as well. Like food, when I think of like food and culture, I also think of fashion as well, like how moccasins are still popular, how there's certain cuts or patterns where people are like, oh my gosh, it's quote unquote tribal, and it's kind of like, how's that, you know, or the boho chic, like how is that like a whole style based off of a culture like
But do you notice also in the use of color and cosmetics and that kind of thing, you know, that transcends indigenous people. Look at indigenous people's dress. Look at Africans' dress. Look at Latinos at dress. Look at Latinx people. There's that symbolism or that thing that binds us all through all of us is like color, and that it's like being a peacock that comes out to be, and you know, I want to represent my people and I want to show that I'm a part of my culture. So I do this by expressing myself through clothes and or cosmetics or the way I wear my hair, or you know, this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So question, I have no idea where I'm going with this, just thinking out loud. Food is an interesting one of all those things you were talking about, because British and Northern European food sucks. I'm sorry, but it just does, right? And so, you know, what took over, I mean, basically, if I look at the three, Mexican, Italian, and Asian are like the three major genres of food that most people, if you ask them your favorite food is it, no one's going to talk about boiled potatoes. No one can even name more than about, well, maybe some would.
Hi, Marsha.
It's just interesting to ask, like, you know, how much do you assimilate things from multiple cultures? This goes back to the one I'm looking forward to in January, February, is about the difference between like assimilation and or appropriation versus, you know, legitimate respect for the thing, right? So I'm heavily Italian, and it's like everybody loves pasta. Yeah, bring it. Except me, I like Mexican. So, you know, but it's interesting to note that the various cultural foods wiped out anything from the Northern European foods, which hardly anybody can name more than 2 or 3 of anyway, including me. So I don't know what that says about, you know, like I can't even think of any Native American dishes, although the Native American dress typically looks good. But then what is appropriation versus respect for it? Like if I wear moccasins, that sort of thing. So
well, you know, James, interesting you say that. I'm a cookbook fanatic, and I saw some old cookbooks that had piggy pie recipes and that kind of thing in it, and the bean recipe. I just like, who eats this?
Right. Yeah.
Who would want this?
Yep.
Figgy pie? I don't want a figgy pie.
Yeah.
I'd rather eat some beans and rice, right?
Yep. There you go.
That's a whole nother conversation.
Food and culture. Yeah.
Yeah.
See what's good.
And
Yeah.
everybody can boil an egg. I mean, that's not cuisine. If I had a pot of water or some way, I mean, what's earth shattering about a boiled egg?
Yep. So yeah, like I said, I don't know how that relates necessarily. It's just interesting that food
That's
is
cool.
very diverse. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the more people come together, the more diverse it even gets, because it's like we each bring something, and then it just kind of transforms over time. So like something that we might eat, just like meat and potatoes, and it's like that's a dish people ate way back when. I mean, maybe
Right.
the meat wasn't all the way cooked or something, but like that's a dish that we still have that's carried out over time. Someone grew the potatoes, someone got the meat, and sure, like things again happen differently. But I think it's really important to point out too, because I know like especially with Indigenous culture, it's like how do we provide those experiences where it's like I get to understand, I get to sing and dance and eat, not to appropriate the culture, but to appreciate. 'Cause
Right.
Growing up, it's like you go to Sturbridge Village to understand the colonial times, but it's from like a European perspective. And I remember always being like, why can't we do the Indigenous people? Oh, it's disrespectful if we do it for them. And I'm kind of sitting here, I'm like, but I want to know. Like, I don't want to be disrespectful. I just want to know more. And then when you go to those places and actually like eat and dance and understand, it's transformative, because it's just like, wow, like this is a whole other like race and culture that like I'm learning to appreciate more. So.
I think that can be said as an example for Juneteenth. Many people didn't know that, the color red is the symbolism of slavery and the struggle, and that having red Kool-Aid and red velvet cake is a thanks to our ancestors for not the thanks, but what they went through and survived, and to accentuate that we respect them for what they gave up, and I think that whole diaspora is coming alive, and people are exploring Juneteenth, not to take anything away from what our conversation is here. But I think it's the new thing that, people are exploring, Juneteenth. As far as Native American cultures and Indigenous people, I think there's a lot left to learn. So it's like Marcia said, there are a lot of resources, but it's so much. I visited recently, maybe a month ago when I was back, the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C. Fantastic. Just as moving for me as the African American History Museum. And deep down, I don't know if I have a connection. I always feel when I get that moved with something that there's a deeper connection within me that I need to explore further. So perhaps I need to go back in my family and dig deeper. But I was moved when I went through the Native American Museum as well in DC. And I don't know if anyone has ever been there, but it's fascinating if you haven't been.
Yes, it is. It's very, very powerful. I remember I went there shortly after the Sturbridge Village stuff, and I went to in middle school. I remember like talking to my parents being like, I still need more. And we went to that museum in Washington, D.C. It's very powerful if you get a chance to go. Also, Cape Cod has some as well. If you drive up, they have some natural museums as well. That are really cool as well to see how like the impact that Indigenous people had on the environment, and also how it's still being honored and celebrated. So every state does it differently. I know that's in Massachusetts. Connecticut has some. Washington, D.C. there's national museums, but always stay educated. There's a lot out there.
Yeah, and just as you said earlier, Cassie, it's interesting. Like in Massachusetts, I learned of this tribe of people. Napatak, God forgive me, I know I'm saying it wrong, which is primarily people of African descent that live just in Springfield, in the Springfield area. And I'm fascinated by that, and I'm trying to learn more about that. But you don't know what you don't know till you discover it. So that is something that I discovered on my own. So I'm looking in that history because, you know, who knew? I
Yeah.
didn't. So, you know.
Yeah, and see what's around too. I know in Stores, Connecticut, they have a an annual powwow where a bunch of tribes come together. And if you ever get a chance to go, it's like it's phenomenal. I remember once I just stumbled upon it accidentally. I'm like, oh, I hear drumming. I wanna go check that out. And then like it's really powerful if you get to be in that space and not only experience but like ask others about like what their experience has been like in the state of Connecticut as an Indigenous person, and to be a part of that.
And you know, because Windsor is so close to Massachusetts, I would assume that there is a lot of, or there was a lot of tribal sharing between. I mean, you know, we share the Connecticut River. We share the Connecticut River. So
Yeah.
what, Marcia? You're on mute.
Another thing that I found powerful was to see exhibits of what is called art. And, you know, I think so often, probably white people have collected art as exotic. But there was an exhibition in the Met a couple of years ago, and I have their catalog because it gave so much historical information. And what blows my mind away is how unbelievably gorgeous and meticulously and creatively made some of these functional artifacts were. And so, you know, it may have been collected as exotic, but to me, it is so powerful to learn about the culture from what they were able to create. And how we could ever denigrate that just blows my mind away, because it's so gorgeous and beautiful. So that, I think that's another area is, you know, taking a look at things like this and exhibitions and history museums and so forth, that I think, and that's one of the things I think that's happened in the last several years that is on the slightly positive side, is I think we've gotten more aware of looking at cultures that we have dismissed and really trying to learn. So I'm hoping that that is a growing pattern rather than a momentary plus.
Marcia, has there ever been any exhibition of Native American art at the Windsor Arts Museum?
No.
That would be so fascinating.
Actually, in the beginning, I looked into it because I was trying to, there's a website, which now I can't remember, but it was sharing art of, you know, if they're looking for an artist of a particular culture in Connecticut. And I was looking for Indigenous, and I really had trouble finding anything. And
wow.
That doesn't mean, and my memory's bad, so it doesn't mean it wasn't there. I don't remember why, you know, but I don't remember finding anything that I could, you know, bring to Windsor. But I think it's a really good thing to keep looking for. And my guess is it's there and I didn't see it, you know, kind of thing too. So I think it would be a great thing to
and I think that speaks to also music and poetry and the written word, that kind of thing. I don't hear much from that diaspora. I mean, it's my own ignorance that, you know, I haven't explored it more than I should. So you're absolutely right. But a exhibition of that type at the art museum would be great. And I'm right across the street from it. So
Yep. Want to volunteer?
Don't tempt me, Marcia. Don't, you know how I am. Don't tempt me. That's just like giving me a dog biscuit, you know. It's like
I think treat. It's a great idea. We'll have to see what we can find out.
There you go.
And there is a lot, yeah. There's a lot of music out there too from Indigenous youth. I forgot where I found it from, but I went to an event with Indigenous youth voices, And then I got sent a playlist. If you would like the playlist, all right, come on, camera, focus. It's called Indigenous Now. Focus, camera. There we go. And it's basically a whole playlist of Indigenous artists. Some of them are rock, then there's some folk music. There's like all sorts of different types of genres, and it's like people aren't aware. Like the whole playlist, it was actually updated last week. You see how long it's 6 hours and 20 minutes. There's like, oh, there's 100 songs on here. And it's kind of like, you know, it's like, why don't we hear them on the radio? Why don't we hear, you know, because some of them are really good. It's just like, what? Like,
so maybe Marcia, we can get an exhibit at the Arts Museum for next year in November.
I don't know. They plan about a year ahead. I'll have to see how they scheduled. I'll check into it though.
So I have an interesting observation too, if I may. This is going to get deep, so follow me on this. There's a lot of parts to it. So Native Americans are roughly 1% of the population, about 3 million. I just looked it up. Italians are about 6%. I'm mostly Italian. And then African Americans or Black of various backgrounds are about 13%. And it's interesting to ask what aspect of a culture influences the mainstream. And so Italians clearly influenced food, right? And it's interesting because the Black culture clearly influenced music. All the major genres came out of the Black community, right? Which is, you know, obviously rap, rock, but you can go back to blues, which is one of my favorite things, right? And you go into jazz, maybe swing is a little bit of, you know, European influence on the otherwise Black music. But it's interesting that the magnitude of the Black culture is clearly affecting society more because just by taking over music and nothing else. But at 13%, there's a certain amount of influence. Now, Italian culture took over the food, but it's interesting to notice, or you know, one of the major players in the food space. It's interesting to note, though, that European food sucks. I'm not saying that just a joke, right? And it's like, okay, so there was a space there. And so, you know, music out of the Black community throughout 150 years, mostly because of slavery and the reasons to have music bonding you together, just gave it a force. And so what's interesting is I think one of the most interesting dimensions of the Native American culture is spirituality. Because as a pagan Wiccan kind of person myself, right, it's like I like the natural religions and the natural spirituality, which I believe Native American culture is extremely strong in. Now watch this though. The European migration to the what is now the United States was actually heavily religious. So it's interesting to observe that there was a strong religious force and crappy food. I'm going to use the food because I think it matters in terms of watching the forces. And it was funny that other cultures with better food, if I may be biased, were able to crush the European food. But the religion was so strong that one of the greatest strengths, I think, because different communities contributed things, but one of the greatest strengths of the Native American tribes was the spirituality. But there was such a religious component to the European migration that I think it crushed it. So the thing I think that that I take most from the Native American community is the thing that also happened to be one of the biggest things that the Europeans came with, and therefore it crushed it. Whereas the food thing was a gap and the music thing was a gap, and so other cultures were able to fill that in. So I'll say all that to say the spirituality of the Native American culture is one of the things I'm always most interested in, like you said, with the dream catchers and stuff like that, and just the fact that it's based in the earth as opposed to anything more deity oriented. And but it's also interesting to watch the population percentage and also which aspects of the culture and how that competes with the European culture and where the gaps are. It all kind of plays together.
I think it's interesting to say too, James, that even with the spirituality, there's a difference between the diasporas. You know, the cultures, some you know, they find their spirituality in a god or a deity, where so does Native American cultures, but it's many of them, and it's right. The spirit of the earth and the environment and saving the environment, which is not so much what other cultures believe in, they fail to recognize that as much as Native American and Indigenous cultures do.
Right.
That this is sacred land. They say this is sacred land, that we honor Mother Nature.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And Father Sky or whatever, you know, they recognize the tree as a living thing.
Yeah.
The river as a living viable thing. And I don't know, you know, spiritually, I don't know if Christianity has grown from that they don't really recognize that as much.
Right. Yep. Agreed. Well, even like, you know, praising the spirits of the animals that you have to kill in order to survive. Kind of
exactly.
Native American culture. There's nothing like that in Christianity. I was raised in Christianity, and so I'm like, don't recall it. Single chapter or verse that would say that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also interesting too with the stones and the earth, because that's something that's becoming more popular now. Like currently, people wearing the different stones and practicing like sound healing and different traditions, and it's kind of like when I talk with people about it, I'm like, so you do realize this is from their culture, and it's like, no, like it's just like up and coming, and it's kind of like you're talking about the 14,
Nope.
it's kind of like what, but this has been here, like
I know.
credit where credit's due, and it's like because there's like a lot of that going on. I don't know if you've been to the shop called Mendazi's in Connecticut. It's great. Like it's I think it's in Windsor as well.
Yep.
And it's like
Yeah.
there's a lot of different sessions that are offered, a lot of different stones, but I'm kind of like when you get back to it, it's kind of like who had the roots of this here, and
Right.
here in our land, yes, it was indigenous people, but at the same time, like there are other cultures from like the European nations and other nations who may have similarities in cultures, where you kind of look at like the different similarities across the cultures. Like take fairy tales, for example. Like there's a Cinderella story for indigenous people and it's really interesting because it's not the modern version that people expect, and how and how the use of hair was a symbol, and how how the earth was incorporated into that, and how like she burned her hands, but then the whole story is interesting to do a cross comparison across like what's similar across cultures, but also what's popular. And so that way when you go back and give credit where it's due, it's kind of like actually it's not just these people over here in the European nations, it's also we gotta dial it back and really appreciate the indigenous people, because it's like I don't see as many celebrations as much celebrating indigenous people, whether it's music or food or dance or different healing sessions. There are quite a few of those in Connecticut, but I don't see as much celebration per se.
It's interesting that you say that, Kathy, about the Mendazi shop. I'm not saying that name right. I've been in there a couple of times. I am a incense burner and a sager.
So is my wife. Oh, open
And
the windows.
I love that shop. I love that shop.
Yeah.
Tell your wife I love her. I haven't even met her, but I love her.
I can tell when she sages a house. It does smell good, but she has a
Yeah.
whole ritual around that. Yeah.
Tell Mrs. Madison I love her.
I'll let her know.
But it's like when you go in there, and I was in there one time, and there was another lady in there. She was bringing this lady for the first time. This was her first experience. And the woman said I heard her say to her friend that she felt like she was turning her back on Christianity and her God by being there.
Yep.
Because she was relating, I think the woman was West Indian. She was relating it to voodoo. And I don't think she understood the meaning of everything that was going on in the store, because the lady was bringing her for a spiritual reading. And she thought that was a derogatory toward what her Christianity beliefs were. And it was interesting that they were arguing back and forth about that. But I think, I relate the spirituality of a shop like that to not witchcraft or voodooism, but to spirituality.
Yeah.
And I don't think it displaces anything about a person's religious beliefs, other than I go in there because I like incense and I like saging, and anything that can help me get closer to the Lord, I'm all for it.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. But if I could, I was raised in Assemblies of God and Southern Baptist traditions, right? And this is what I mean by the strength of the European connection to Christianity. If you look at Calvinism, some of the more pure threads of Christianity, I was raised by a whole family church that said that stuff is voodoo, it's witchcraft, it's evil, it's dangerous. In fact, the reason I'm an atheist, pagan, Wicca kind of person today is precisely because everyone told me how evil it was. So I said, I better study it so I understand how dangerous it is. And I'm like, this is actually more compelling than what I was taught in Christianity, my personal beliefs, right? But I know that Christianity, hardcore Christians, I got to be careful, right? Because there's a lot of people across all spectrums. But I was raised in the hardcore Christian world, and it really does perceive a lot of as voodoo and danger. That's why there's an interesting question. That's why I said when Europeans came over with their very strong religious views, how much did they look at the spirituality of the Native Americans and indigenous people, and how different it is? And to this day, the person you talk, I can see people in my family. I was told all this stuff as I was raised, like, that's witchcraft, it's voodoo, it's evil, it's from the devil. It's like, wow, that stuff is scary. Now I go to Mendias and I'm like, this place is cool because I've totally rethought everything. But it's like, no, it's scary. But understand, that's not just you talking about your friend and me talking about my upbringing. Go back 200-300 years. That's how the Europeans came over thinking. And they saw these people who were doing things in sync with nature and dream catchers and stones and like, ooh, scary evil. But I'll leave that to whoever's beliefs are at hand. But from a oppression perspective, you can see where that would have such a tremendous effect.
Yes.
Which is why to this day it's interesting to watch it emerge. And as you're saying, Cassie, it's like, hey, folks, there's a long tradition here. Not just Native American. You can look at it. You can see threads of this in Hinduism, certain elements of it, but there's not a lot in Christianity. I'll tell you that, just having been raised in it. And it goes back to the 2 A's, which I want to add a third A. It's appropriation versus appreciation versus assimilation. By force is terrible, right? That's what I call assimilation. But it is going to be an interesting question as the years go by, and spirituality is catching on. I watched the trends on paganism and Wicca just because I'm into those belief systems, and it's really popular. But like, how much are people going to understand? Some of Wicca and paganism actually is rooted in a little bit of European history, but that got crushed by Christianity, obviously. But there's more of that spirituality in the Native American culture. How much are people going to connect back to that? And then how much of that is going to have an appreciation? Because even in the community that grew that, right? It's like, do you get upset when a white kid raps? I don't know. Is Eminem evil or is he, really cool? Because he's a white rapper, right? And so when you look at, the use of spiritual belief systems, how much might people in the Native American community be concerned about that, or like want to connect to it and say, yes, thank you for being a part of it? I don't know. It's a tricky question.
Excellent.
Yeah, it is tricky because it really depends on like who you're with, like the community you're surrounded by. I know I've seen some different indigenous groups where they'll use the spiritual practice to understand environmentalism and make ecological changes based off of like the beliefs. But then I've also seen other groups where it's just kind of like it's more of like using sound and music itself, which I have seen some Christian groups adopt, by the way.
Yep.
It's kind of ironic when you said that, and I'm kind of like, but then there's this, which is also like, I think that's up and coming that we're gonna talk about more. But it's kind of like, so how do we still like appreciate that as people are kind of like taking it as their own, saying it's mine, but when it's really not. I also think too, something I was thinking about before is the use of clothes and crocheted clothes, and how like that's a big thing also within different Christian groups to have like crocheted groups. But then like if you look at the meaning behind it, and again, like there's subjective to like different cultures and everything, but in indigenous culture about like weaving like it was like weaving like the past, the present, and like the connections together. So there's more of like a spiritual meaning to crocheting. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen in other groups. I think there's like a common ground that people might be able to come together to understand more. Like I'll connect myself and my experiences to understand someone else who's different from me. That's not to say like, oh, I'm making it about me. I was like, no, I'm trying to connect so that way we form a bridge together per se.
Right.
So like, how can we do that across our cultures? Like here in the United States, like how can we do more of that? Not just mainstream, but locally.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just food
And
for thought. Yeah.
well, no, it's interesting because I'm not trying to beat on Christianity. It's interesting because my wife gives me a hard time all the time. She was raised in a very progressive Christian environment. And when I say Christians believe, she's like, no, the people who raise you believe. I'm like, okay, thank you. Progressive Christianity, when it adopts, especially if it starts adopting other things, can be as cool as anything else that just blends and adopts. So I agree. Yeah. But I was far off from the, like I said, Assemblies of God and Southern Baptist is about as strong as you can get, I think. And it was just interesting to have my wife and see her world. And, I asked her father one day, who's a preacher. I'm like, do you believe the Bible is literal? He's like, no. I'm like, oh. Well, that changes the entire conversation because now it's a set of culture and ideas, and you can run with it. But when any religion is open to blending with other things, it becomes richer. You take the best of. Again, that's why I'm still looking forward to that conversation about with appropriation versus appreciation. It's just really tricky to tell.
It is, yeah. And you never know. And unless you ask, there's a lot with fashion. It's constantly with fashion, with like even using the concept of fringe or different patterns and things like that. And I know we're going to talk even deeper about it this February during Black History Month as well. And we're going to bring that up again, saying there's an intersection with Black and Indigenous people with the appropriation versus appreciation. So
Right.
Actually, there's an intersection with Black, Indigenous people, Latinx, and
Yep.
Asian.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And white people. We have an intersection with white people too. So I mean, it's like
Yeah, it's big. Yeah, there's quite.
let's not forget that, you know, and it goes back to that conversation we had last week, James, where we were talking about how, you know, people don't talk about the disparities and things that, you know, of people of the European diaspora that are, you know, underserved and underprivileged.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So there's a whole connectivity there that, you know, the question there would be, how do you explore the underserved, underprivileged, you know, Caucasoid diaspora?
Yeah.
Yep.
Because it goes to the argument of, well, they can change their situation, but we can't change ours. You know, we have all these barriers where they can easily assimilate out.
Hmm. And I think an interesting part of the assimilation has been changed or altered due to social media.
Yeah.
Like one of the final questions that we have for today, which is kind of, how does social media positively and negatively impact people's understandings about Indigenous people? Because let me tell you, there are some offensive memes out there. Memes are pictures that convey like messages, attitudes, sometimes jokes to others, pictures with 1,000 words and ideas. And some of them are promoting bias and hatred. And some of them are just genuinely like, oh, that's interesting information and facts. But how do, like, what are all of y'all's thoughts on it? Is how does social media positively or negatively influence Indigenous people? Because without social media, I wouldn't have found that group of youth, like of Indigenous youth who are doing like incredible work. There's like coalition work, there's like music, like revolution, there's like all sorts of stuff. So I see there's like a positive side to it, but there's also a negative side as well with promoting bias and hatred.
Positively, it's like fake news. You know, you as a person have to choose what, you know, what fits you. I did my own exploration and I sent you all those snippets that I sent that I was excited over. And I learned a lot from even watching the snippets like on YouTube. And it gave me like the first snippet you showed with that information on it. That was very informational for me. So I think as far as social media is concerned, you have to be the person, okay, take this at face value until you do the exploration yourself.
Absolutely.
But history is history and truth is truth.
Mhm.
And like that first slide presentation, that first snippet that you showed was truth is truth. You know, history is history. So.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thanks for sharing, because it is a tricky place, social media. But any other thoughts or comments, or you can just continuously think to yourself about it?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing is going to do categorically, in my mind, the social media will accelerate things that changes that are determined by access to information. So it used to be almost impossible. Right? So even when I was raised hardcore Christian and everyone told me secular humanism was evil, so I had to go study it because I study things that I don't agree with on purpose. And so I mentioned I'm a capitalist. I have a second thought on YouTube. I watch it all the time. The guy's an open, avowed Marxist, and I watch it all the time because it's really good, logical thought, and I listen to it. And so I said I better study secular humanism because my pastor and my mother are telling me it's horrible, evil, wicked, bad, nasty. It was actually hard to find literature on that. And so you can use the library and things like that. Now you type secular humanism browsing, you know it instantly. Like the affirmations of humanism come right up at the top. You click it, you read it, in 5 minutes, you're done. And it took me a while to get a hold of any literature like that. So it's like, okay, that was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, wow, 35 years ago. And so it went from, gee, I wonder where I even find such a thing, which took me months to figure out, to literally 2 minutes.
Mm.
Like that's it. So that's the effect of all social media and access to information. Now the question becomes, what are the set of all things that are ready for change, but the change must have information flowing? This is why Hitler burnt books, for example, because it slowed the information flow. I don't know what the set of all things is, but it's just categorically, it's the set of all things such that it's like, yeah, no, society would change if people knew. People now can know, and people can now change. And so now, does that influence some of the things we're talking about here? I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, because information's constantly changing, and social media like constantly churns out like information that's both factual and also like disinformation. But like you, the user, have to be educated and understand in a language and from a cultural perspective that it's coming in. Like there's all these different factors where it's like if it's coming out in one way and it's like I'm not understanding the social media post because it's not in a language, or I don't understand the reference that they're making, or I don't. So it's a lot. That's where there's like a lot of different perspectives and interpretations of information, and that gets into like where we are as a society with like how do you kind of disperse what's fact versus fiction, because our reality is so distorted. And I think the same can be said for indigenous culture. People can't tell what's fact and fiction. There are some people who will be out there and be like, oh yeah, the Wild West stories that you see from like the 20s and 30s. Let me tell you, it's cringe, but like some people are into that. Some people will take that as fact, saying this is how it was. This is the truth. When it's kind of like, well, when you start to look at things with a critical eye, you might see things a bit differently. So again, kind of an ongoing conversation about using critical thinking tools, but how can you translate critical thinking across cultures? Because it's going to look and feel different depending on where each of us come from and all the identities that we hold. But that's a rhetorical question, but just some food for thought. But yeah, I agree, James. It's very complicated.
Yeah. Well, it's also a question of what's going to dominate, right? So you have access to primary sources more than any other time before, right? So one of the things, whenever I see something scary, I think I told you guys the example I did last time, with Joe Biden. He said 6 seconds of gobbledygook on an evening news broadcast, and he sounded like a complete buffoon. And I looked up that 6-second clip out of the 6-minute discussion he had. It was the one where he was talking about where he was the lifeguard. And he came across as a person of character and balance and thought in that 6-minute blurb. But yeah, okay, stumble over his word for 6 seconds. So going back to source material is an interesting, powerful thing. The challenge you have with that is how many people are actually going to do that? And so it's almost like, are you going to net out? It's like, yeah, you have more access to more information than ever, and you have more garbage coming at you. And what's it going to do? It's going to be the same thing that if we were 100 years ago, there's a certain number of people who would have gone to the library, tried to find it, asked for a book to be shipped from some other country, and waited 3 weeks. Okay, fine. Yeah, and there's also the person who would just, be totally deceived and buy the snake oil down the street. So I don't know. It's like, maybe we're not going to get anything different. It's just going to be faster.
Yeah. Yeah. And who's going to invest the time and energy to understand? Like, I know, as we're going to come to a close later on for this program, I always share helpful resources. And I put it out there. I'm like, oh, hopefully someone will use it and for their education. But at the same time, like, who's actually going to care enough to do that? Right. Because it's just like, what, we're in a society where people, care more about the likes and more about the money than they do about the knowledge. Mm-hmm. So like the knowledge isn't as worthwhile unless it makes the money, where it should be vice versa. So it's really interesting, the society that we live in. And I always bring that up for contemporary thought because when I look at indigenous culture, there's a lot with storytelling, a lot with sharing your story and your narrative and really understanding your ancestry and roots. But if we don't know how to do that with social media, how are we going to continue that with our family and social media? Because social media is a tool that is used to connect people, but also to divide people. And family is also interwoven in that story.
Yeah. Well, the scariest thing too about social media and online is the artificial intelligence that feeds you what you already believe, because you'll click on it more and it angers you. So it is a little bit scary in that regard. It's like they know your stuff. You can go like Facebook, it will tell you you can see what they believe about you, and it tells you your political affiliation. It knows who you are. And it's like, okay, so they do two things with that. One is they feed you what you already believe, which just reinforces confirmation bias. The other thing is they feed you stuff that makes you mad, because people are more likely to click on things that make them mad. And so that's why I say we're not as divided a nation as the media. I said this last time we had a meeting. It's like, we're not as divided as you think, because we are specifically inflamed by the algorithms, because that makes money. And I say as a capitalist, it's profit motive can be dangerous too, right? But it's like, we are specifically fed stuff that reinforces our confirmation bias and makes us angry. So that's the scary part of social media more than anything else. That's why it's like you got to step outside what the feed gives you, and do the second, third page of those search results and read that, not just the first stuff at the top. That's the scariest part for me.
No, absolutely. And like seeing how we engage with one another too, because there are some Indigenous groups on Facebook and social media, and like how can we like find that common ground when there's all these different barriers and factors. But yeah.
For me, I think the thing is when we offer programming like this, and we have all of 7 or 8 people who attend, but then people say that I'm interested and I want to learn, but you don't show up.
Right. No, I know it's difficult. It's like, how can you get people to invest their time and their attitudes to care more about each of these issues? Right. Yeah. And that's the difficult part, because it's like, I can't force people to come, but here's what we can do. And we're all going to just try and do our best with it. But it's very interesting to see how it's changing over time.
Yeah, because Patrick said we had 16 people. We have all of 8, 7, 1
yeah.
left.
Someone dropped off early. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but yeah, definitely interesting. And I'm glad that we were here today to have like this conversation.
I think Marsha had something to say,
Yeah,
Cass.
go ahead. Yeah, no, go ahead. If you have anything to say, go ahead. I was just going to say, if any of you have any questions you want to pose or final thoughts before we close out, feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself. I hope this was fruitful for people.
You're on mute, Marsha.
I just wanted to respond to the number of people that aren't showing up today. That could be lack of interest. It also could be this is an extremely busy time of year. And a lot of people are sick. We've been sick all week. So, I think there are other reasons, but that is always a challenge for me is how do you reach people that aren't interested? Because a lot of the people that are interested are open, but a lot of the people that aren't interested are not open. And that can be fear. It can be so many different reasons. And so it's constantly trying to offer different kinds of things and by different groups and so forth. And we just keep working, you just never know. When there's a quote from, brain fog again, but it's probably William James or one of the Jameses. You with your memory will probably remember it, James, but it's teacher affects eternity. You never know where your influence ends. Well, mine has always been a teacher or us or whoever we're trying to help learn affects eternity. You never know where your influence begins.
True. And I, as a person that has been on this commission for quite some time, I often I keep my community in my forethought, but I often get discouraged because of lack of participation. And I understand life happens. I understand that. But it's like, well, if nobody's attending, should I continue with this? Is this a burnt bridge? What? It's discouraging in a way.
Yes, I can understand that.
So it's just like, and I understand life happens and we have a soccer game and it's Christmas time and it's all good. I understand that though.
Yeah, agree to this point. The thing that gives me a little bit of hope though is I think of this as like, it's like when you go to the gym and you work out really hard on a machine. It tells you burnt like 120 calories. And then you look at the back of a food container, it's like 350 calories. Like, I got to work out 3 times to burn this off. But hang on. If you know anything about exercise, you know that it's not the 120 calories at the gym. It's that you've changed your baseline metabolism and you burn 1,000 calories for the next several days. So to me, to some extent, you exchange ideas here. I have a lot of things I got to chew on and think about. It was good to take a lot of notes. And so this is very helpful. But it's like, this is the 120 calories we all burned here. what it is though is giving you ideas and new ways to think about it and new ways to approach it so that you can go influence other people, right? So I'm in an interesting intersection. We're talking about intersectionality, being on the Human Relations Commission as a very active Republican. And it's like, my Republican friends say, James, what the hell are you doing on the Human Relations Commission? And they're like, what do they even do? And someone said, oh yeah, it's like woke central. I'm like, I'm in a weird place. So, but it gives me a lot of things to think about. And so now I'm going to go back and, kind of say, well, how about if we break it up this way and that way? But it is useful to have better ways to think about things and just factual information, like all the tribes. It's good to know. I just didn't know that factually. So I think we're all here okay, we got on the treadmill, we burnt a few calories, but now we have more things to think about and do. And you influence other people, other groups. You hang out at the VFW, you have a different conversation there with them and that sort of thing. So that helps me.
Right, I agree.
Excellent. Thanks, Cassie, for your presentation today. I really
Yay.
appreciate it. It was awesome as usual. And as you all know, this will be on YouTube and can be shared out with others. This is our last conversation for the year. We are heavy in January and February with activity, both being Bridge Builder Month in January. Then we have Martin Luther King Day events. We also have in February Black History Month. So there's a lot coming on and coming to us in January and February. And I appreciate all my commissioners. I appreciate Marcia for being here today, and our liaison, Patrick, for being a part. I know he over there looking at that soccer game though. But thank you all for being here. I wish you happy holidays, whatever you celebrate, or if you celebrate nothing, it's totally okay. You're all right. Everything's all right. The kids are okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Yes,
Take
thank
good
you.
care.
Yeah,
All
thanks,
right.
guys.
So I'll take
Really
care.
appreciate it. All right, bye.
Commissioners, I'll see you Wednesday.
All right. Wednesday.
I promise.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.